Watch out. The gap in the door. It's a separate reality. The only me is me. Are you sure the only you is you?
A development team that didn't even know what game they were making, a rogue game designer publishing a secret game under a pseudonym, a mystery that set the internet on fire before quickly being scrubbed from existence, an allegory exposing corporate politics that were intended to be kept secret, and one of the most intensely horrifying games ever created. These are the ingredients to the story behind Hideo Kojima's PT. Metal Gear Solid V was the last game that Hideo Kojima developed under Konami's supervision, and while that masterpiece was in development, Kojima's status at the company had been challenged. Another employee at Konami had developed one of those crappy mobile games with loads of microtransactions, and in just a few weeks it had already earned Konami enough to fund the entirety of MGS-V. None of this stuff would come out until much later, but in response to that, Kojima was shifted off of Konami's board of directors and replaced with this new guy. Say what you will about Kojima's games, love him or hate him, the man is an artist with a vision, and as successful as every Metal Gear game had been, they couldn't compare to the income of predatory mobile Skinnerbox games. One thing was clear, Kojima's high-risk, high-reward art had no place at Konami. He and his studio, Kojima Productions, wouldn't be around after MGS-V. His budget was cut, and presumably his time was as well, and MGS-V had to be pushed out the door as quickly as possible so that Konami could turn it into a profit and get him and his idealistic team off of their payroll as soon as possible. It was around this time that an impressive little indie game called PT, from a company called 7780s, appeared for free on the PlayStation Store. After a day of tens of thousands of players poking at the game, eventually players managed to finish the game, and they saw this. Silent Hills, starring Norman Reedus, directed by Hideo Kojima, with assistance from Junji Ito and Guillermo del Toro. This was sure to be the most amazing game ever created. If PT, this playable teaser, proved anything, it's that this was a team that was very capable of handling the Silent Hill property with the same respect that fans had given it for all these years. But here's the really interesting thing. Konami had no idea that this was a thing. They had no idea that Kojima was developing this thing, they had no idea that it was going to be released on the PlayStation Store, and I'd imagine that they had no idea it involved their intellectual property, their game, and their development studio until the game was first completed. In other words, the reveal of Silent Hills was as much a surprise to Konami as it was to any of us. Hideo Kojima managed to bring in Norman Reedus to be 3D scanned. He managed to get confirmation that Junji Ito and Guillermo del Toro would be willing to collaborate on the project, and he managed to develop it without anyone at Konami even knowing. Even the team that worked on PT was kept in the dark for some of the game's development, having been told that they were instead working on a dream sequence for MGS-V, not a separate project altogether. In other words, there was a guy at PlayStation who would allow for this game to be posted onto the store, and the few developers in the credits here, but everyone else in the world was kept in the dark about Kojima's plans to revive the Silent Hill franchise. The question is why? Sure, Kojima is a pretty weird guy if his games are anything to go by, but there's always a method to the madness, a meaning behind everything. So why all the secrecy? If this game was just a viral marketing campaign, the people at Konami would have known about it. Well, the most common theory is that this was Kojima's way of showing his bosses that he would be able to make more and more profitable games for them. By wrapping the game in so much mystery, PT, and more importantly Silent Hills, had about as much hype as any game had ever gotten. However, I propose a different interpretation. I propose that PT was a message to all of Kojima's fans, and in order to dissect that message, I think that it's time we talk about the game itself. And before you click off this video thinking that you've already heard everything there is to say about this game, I expect I'm going to offer some perspectives on the game that nobody else has. My boyfriend is absolutely obsessed with this game and its legacy, and as I've run my interpretations by him, he said multiple times that he's never heard anybody else saying the things I'm saying. After a lot of time, I think I finally discovered the happy ending in this game. Of course, the game's been out for nearly a decade, and it's been in my thoughts for almost as long, so it's going to take us a while to get there, but I consider that to be the point of this video. I know it's a lofty goal and that it's actually impossible for me to achieve this, but I aim to be the person that solves PT, and whether or not I come out of this project with a complete, universal theory of PT doesn't matter as much as the fact that I'm trying to. I want to take all of those loose ends and all these half-truths and unfinished, disconnected ideas and explain just what PT is and what it means. I want something that you could apply to every last detail in the game and find rewarding correlations. So without further ado, let's get into it. Now, I'm not the type to take half measures and write a whole video about a game that I haven't even played. Unfortunately, actually playing PT is difficult. See, 9 months after PT was quietly uploaded to the PlayStation Store, Konami took the game down, and so the only way to play the game is to get your hands on a PS4 that still has it installed, and hasn't had a firmware update in the last few years. There aren't a lot of those left. They go for about double to triple to even quadruple the price of a normal PS4 on eBay. Multiple people have attempted to remake the game on PC, but given their limited resources and the community's limited understanding of the game, these remakes strike me as incomplete, to say the least. But by some miracle, an extremely generous viewer of this channel was willing to send me her PS4, and in a moment that may very well be the highlight of my entire career on YouTube, a career which was partly defined by Kojima's work, I finally got to play the lost Hideo Kojima game. I think before we go any deeper into this game, and get into the really opinionated, subjective, and meta stuff, we should establish some basic facts. Basically, you're in this liminal space, an endlessly looping hallway resembling a house, but with uncanny, nonsensical architecture. There's a second floor, but no way to access it. A bathroom directly in front of the front door. A grandfather clock tolls away at midnight, but the only clock that can be seen in the place is this tiny little digital one. Countless abstract, formless pictures hang on the walls in place of family photographs. A chandelier casts its own shadow. An ancient-looking radio is a few feet away from a digital clock. Seriously, I'd say between the radio, the clock, and the telephone, there's about a 20-year spread of the technology in this house. So anyways, it's an uncanny, nonsensical house. Our character is stuck looping through it over and over again, being toyed with and tormented by 4 distinct entities. The voice on the radio, the baby, the ghost of the baby's mother, named Lisa, and, in a manner of speaking, the game itself. So, the baby and the mother are pretty self-explanatory, but the voice on the radio is a bit of an anomaly that we'll get into by the end of this. Anyways, you play along with their torment until the game quote-unquote crashes, and then when you reset, things are quieter, and based on 2 sets of cryptic clues from the first section of the game, you have to complete a difficult, esoteric set of tasks, at which point the voice on the radio calls your phone, says, "You've been chosen," and you get to leave, and see the reveal that this was a Hideo Kojima game, and that he wants to make Silent Hills. That's all what literally happens in this game. Funnily enough, it's the simplest Hideo Kojima storyline to date, but it's in the subtle details that things get a little bit more complicated. You know, players still haven't exactly solved PT. We've figured out some ways to beat it, and sometimes those methods work, but some players have beaten it without following certain crucial steps, others have followed them to the letter without beating it, and nobody really knows why. At least, not yet. So to start off, let's talk about that difficult, esoteric set of tasks that are hinted at in the 2 ways. First off, there's this text that pops up whenever you collect a different piece of Lisa's torn-up photograph. When you translate all of this text, written in a series of different languages, you get this. During the inert waiting, I stopped moving. I whispered his name, then he slid his index finger over my hand. It was a cold hand. My body was shivering. I waited for it to pass, never moving a step. His hand in mine, and fading through a fog of consciousness, I believe I heard a phone. And throughout the game, specifically in this final never-ending loop, you'll occasionally hear the radio spout off these backwards messages. Reversing them reveals other clues as to your goals. The literal meaning of these messages basically can be summarized as follows. After the game crashes, you want to wait until midnight, as time finally progresses normally for that one important turn of a minute. After the bell tolls, you want to stand near this picture of a guy named Jack, our wife murderer, and you'll hear a baby laugh. That's your cue to start hunting Lisa. Basically, you want to put on headphones and wait for these hauntings to occur. I'll play the sound of one of them in the background as I continue. At this point, you want to use directional audio to trace the source of the noise. It can either be coming from the radio, the telephone, the mirror, or one of these 2 spots. If it's one of these 2 spots, that means that Lisa has manifested physically and is a direct threat to you. Give her some space. However, if the haunting sound is coming from the mirror, the radio, or the telephone, you want to rush over there and stand by it. That's what this line in the list of clues is about. From here, you want to chant into your microphone until you hear a second baby laugh, or until Lisa goes quiet. What you're meant to say into the mic is vague. Some people say that they got this to work by calling out to Lisa, others say it works if you ask for help. Personally, I don't think the game is too picky about it. The first person to solve this game didn't even know that her PS4 was listening to her. She just happened to be streaming and was talking into her mic when it happened. However, I think if we look back at our clues, it's pretty clear that what we're meant to be saying is Jack's name. The clues all say, I whispered his name, and the only he whose name we know is Jack.
I walked till I stood one pace before Jack.
After doing this successfully, we hear the second laugh, and a vibration in the controller. According to the clues, this vibration would represent a chill down our spine, and we're meant to stand perfectly still until the baby laughs a third time, at which point we get the phone call that signifies the end of the game. So, I've still got some theories to test. I'll finish this segment of the video after I've done so, but some of these steps aren't exactly what's written in any guide. So, first off, every guide I've ever seen says you need to take 10 steps after the midnight bells finish, and that will trigger the first laugh. Secondly, most guides say you're meant to simply chant into your mic while staying in this position during a haunting, but that only sometimes works. See, at this position, we're right next to the phone, and if Lisa chooses to haunt the phone at that point, then boom, we're already in position and the game considers us as having tracked down the location of Lisa's haunting. However, if she isn't in the phone, it doesn't work, thus explaining that discrepancy. Luckily, the last one, just stand still, is pretty cut and dry, no ambiguity there, so thankfully I don't have to test that one too. As this footage will show, testing all of this stuff has really had me at my wit's end, but frankly, I want to be the person that solves PT's ending. I don't want to parrot some vague guide that occasionally works. I want to solve this thing, and be able to explain why my solution makes sense. We only ever solved this game by brute force. I want to figure out how we were meant to figure this out. I've already got the third step down. The note says to stand still when Jack touches your hand, and you feel a shiver down your spine. And the second step makes sense too. That moment of sharing space seems to refer to tracking down Lisa's haunting locations. Simple enough. But why do certain names other than Jack's work? In other words, if the note says I whispered his name, why does saying Lisa work, but saying totally random names or phrases doesn't work at all? Then you've got the 10 paces thing. That isn't written anywhere in the notes. The backwards message says I stood a pace away from Jack. Well, if we take 10 paces away from the alarm clock, we're about a pace away from this photo of Jack. But that's not it either. You can take 10 paces in any direction from anywhere on the map, and it'll work. And what's more, sometimes I was able to trigger the first baby laugh just by standing near Jack's photo and not taking 10 paces at all. So, what the hell? The major difficulty of this whole video for me has been solving for those indiscrepancies. I'll be on a decent track with a lot of ideas and interpretations of the clues that make sense, and then something like this will happen. I take my 10 steps, get the first baby laugh, and then this. Lisa can't haunt this door. In fact, I believe that in this clip, she was all the way over here in the bathroom mirror, and yet I got the second baby laugh. I wasn't even chanting. Sure enough, my controller started vibrating, I stood still, got the third laugh, and was able to complete the game. Moments like this remind me that in PT, even after all these years, we can't be sure of anything. This game is trying to make me think I'm crazy. And because moments like this, where standing next to Jack's photo triggered the first laugh, only happened just as I stopped recording, it's kind of working. The game is playing my own prudence against me, making fun of me for doing so much testing instead of just progressing to the ending. Me and my player character were experiencing the horror of this purgatory together. Testing this stuff has been draining on me. I don't scare easily, but the fact that about, a 30th of the time, Lisa does something that I didn't expect and can't explain keeps me on the edge of my seat. As I learn more and more about the game, I get more confident, but even now, I frequently cover my eyes while turning the camera and just peek between the gaps in my fingers to nullify any jump scares. Not a lot of things give me nightmares, but I'm afraid of nightmares nonetheless. So, as happy as I am to finally be playing this game for real, I have to keep it at an arm's length, especially since I do most of my writing and testing at night. I mean, hell, even as I wrote this, I was simply driving through the night, narrating to my phone's voice-to-text, and getting ready to edit it all down later. Stopping the car in some dimly lit, empty park in the dead of night like I usually do when I write just seems too, scary for this subject matter. Anyways, here's what I found in my interpretation. This is how you beat PT without relying on random chance and strategies that only work sometimes. If you want to beat PT, you want to go through a linear sequence of scares up until you get to this loop, where the phone says hello next to it. Then you zoom in on that text, walk away, and repeat this until you've moved the word hell over to this part of the wall. Zoom in on this text and you'll hear Lisa laugh. That's your cue to keep moving. Once you get to the red, running hallway, look for this spot where a painting has fallen off of the wall, revealing a peephole. Zoom into the peephole until the murder audio stops, and continue until you've got to the final loop, where time progresses normally until midnight, and Lisa haunts you every now and then. At any point after the midnight bells toll, you'll want to take 10 steps in any direction. You'll hear a baby's laugh. Plug in your headphones and use directional audio to tell where Lisa's haunting you from, either the radio, the phone, the mirror, or these two locations where she can manifest physically. Go to the source of the haunt and chant either Lisa, Jack, Jay, Jareth, or one of the other names that randomly works until you hear a second baby laugh. Then stand perfectly still until the controller stops vibrating and you'll hear a third laugh. After that, just walk to the ringing phone, zoom in to answer it, and walk out the door to complete the game. This is a completely foolproof strategy. If, for whatever reason, the mic doesn't like how you were chanting, you can just wait until the next haunting and try again at Lisa's next location. And by the way, the mic isn't just looking for random noise. I tried various other names that had no presence in the game's lore, as well as chanting Hideo Kojima and Kojima Hideo. And not once did any of those names work. The fact that chanting Lisa instead of Jack works so reliably seems to be a deliberate decision by the devs. We'll see if I can make some sense of facts like that by the end of this video. So, why does any of this matter? This isn't exactly the usual fare for my channel. Well, after my first playthrough, where I was just blindly following a guide once my memory stopped being specific enough, I remarked afterwards that it felt like I had done the video game equivalent of summoning Bloody Mary, or one of those other spooky dares you'd get as a kid. I was taking part in a ritual. While obviously it's a great shame that it's so hard to get your hands on this game, its status as a lost game adds to the mystique in a way that I can hardly describe. It felt like I had just played through Been Drowned or some other equivalent video game creepypasta. This was a lost game, something that I just wasn't meant to be playing. It's a game that has completely eluded everybody. Nobody knows how it works. Nobody knows what makes Lisa do one thing in one person's playthrough and another thing entirely in another player's. And even as I was playing it, my boyfriend and I kept on swearing that we saw these things out of the corners of our eyes and in the shadows that might have been there or might not have been. Even writing about this game as I was sitting on my porch looking out into the tree line at the dead of night, it just felt like I was doing something dangerous simply by engaging with this game. It reminds me of how I felt watching horror movies as a kid, thinking about how poetic it would be for this to be the exact moment that I discovered that ghosts and monsters were real and vengeful. I promise you that this is not something common for me. I really don't scare easily. I love watching horror movies, I love playing horror games, and I love sleeping like a baby after playing something like Silent Hill 2. But this was just different. This time it felt like the thing I played wasn't even created to be enjoyed, but to literally haunt my world. It was meant to follow me, even after I quit playing the game. And as I drown myself in the work of this video and surround myself fully with the intricate details of this game, that's what it feels like. Like this genuine horror that goes beyond any piece of media is just surrounding me. Before I get into who that voice on the radio is, I'd like to talk about the fourth entity that's tormenting our character as he navigates these halls. The game itself. See, while the most immediately obvious example of a classic Hideo Kojima fourth wall break in this game would be the moment when the game crashes just before the final puzzle, that's only the tip of the iceberg, though. There are a lot of things in this game that I simply can't justify as being part of the fiction. Why does zooming in the camera cause our character to interact with things? Why is a critical part of the game's story delivered to us through this text that flashes on our screen as we pick up the pieces of Lisa's photos? Why does the radio in the game itself chant Hideo Kojima's birthday at us? There's another big example, but that opens a can of worms that I'm not really ready to talk about at this point in the video. The simple answer is that, much like the Psycho Mantis boss fight in Hideo Kojima's first 3D game, Metal Gear Solid, the horror here is being experienced less by the player character and more by the player themselves. That text on the screen, quickly flashing whenever you pick up one of Lisa's photo fragments, I don't think our player character really cares about that, or can even see it. To the actual player, however, it's just a reminder that even though they've just found one of these intricately hidden puzzle pieces, they still aren't really anywhere near being able to actually crack this thing and understand what it is that they're doing. That feeling just adds to the horror. However, I'm getting dangerously close to talking about the meta side of this game, and I think that we need to pair that with some of the more literal details. Remember, I see this game not primarily as a proof of concept or as a pitch to Konami, or even as a playable teaser. I see this game's main point as being a message from Hideo Kojima directly to his most dedicated fans. So hopefully this section will be as interesting to you all as this is to me. Basically, the story of PT strongly connects with that of Silent Hill 2 in particular. I think that what makes that game work so well is the crossroads between a very modern story of a man being unfaithful to and eventually killing his terminally cancerous wife, and an ancient cult that somehow manages to predict this sort of behavior. While the cult stuff is strictly kept in the background of both games, it's an important part to understanding either of them. In PT, our radio personality talks about a trend of similar incidents in which a husband, disgruntled with the system and the circumstances of his life, snaps and kills his wife and child. According to the radio host, it's something that's really been on the rise lately, with a series of similar crimes spanning the last 100 years or so. Whether it was our player character who killed Lisa, or this Jack person who seemingly isn't the same person we're playing as, seeing as we don't look anything like his portraits, that doesn't matter as much as the fact that this trend of wife murdering has been going on for a while. Point is, Jack was yet another perpetrator in this trend of wife murdering. As the baby explains in the sink, Jack was fired from his job and he drowned his sorrows in booze. Upset that his wife had to take a part-time job where she was ogled at by her manager, he snapped. We get to hear the moment of the murder when we peek through the peephole into the bathroom during the running section. I'm gonna play the audio here. Fair warning, it's pretty gruesome. When you see our perspective emerge from the peephole, it's safe to unmute if you don't want to hear this.
I'm talking to all the fine, upstanding folks got their welfare cut, got their jobs pulled out from under us. You know what to do. Now's the time. Do it.
Did you catch that? In the background of this murder that presumably took place several years earlier, we hear that exact same radio host with the exact same age behind his voice, encouraging Jack to kill his family. This is where we get into the mystical side of things, something along the lines of straight-up cult recruitment tactics. Basically, in my mind, because the radio host is describing multiple murders with conflicting details, I think that our player character is the most recent perpetrator in this string of similar murders. And as we hear about all these murders, as we're surrounded by the echoes of these murders, we write, "I can hear them calling from hell" on the wall. Because that's exactly what's happening. These murderers are essentially speaking to us through that voice on the radio. Well, in the next loop after that, a different voice is on the radio, a Swedish voice. I'll translate it as we go along, but listen to this bit in particular.
Så kanske du redan upptäckte. Ja, radiodramat från 75 år sedan var sanning. De är här på vår.
He says something about a famous broadcast from 75 years ago, around when the murders started. He's referring to the infamous War of the Worlds radio drama from 1938, which many people thought was real, and so they began barricading their homes and stockpiling for an alien invasion. It's a lesson in just how susceptible people are to suggestion, and it's a lesson that I think the radio host is capitalizing on as he encourages Jack to kill his family. He has Jack convinced that this is something akin to a movement, an uprising, something that all the guys are doing once they get tired of feeling like sheep. In other words, for whatever reason, this radio host is part of his own self-fulfilling prophecy. He's creating a reality where husbands are murdering their families, and Jack was just another piece of that scheme. He's making the War of the Worlds radio drama broadcast into the real thing. The gap in the door, it's a separate reality. The only me is me. Are you sure that the only you is you? This is the quote that opens up the game, and I think that this reality that the other host is creating is that other world. There's only one radio host, but there's two versions of you. The one that got fired from his job and used booze to cope, and the one that went on to kill his wife. Opening that door and listening to that radio host is what moves you from one version of yourself to the other. If we want to get a little bit less abstract with this, let's look at it this way. How would the radio host know all of these intricate details of these murders? He's saying things that even the police wouldn't be able to know, about how the killer lured his daughter out of the bathroom by saying it was just a game. That's not going to be on any police report for any of these murders, especially on a house that's seemingly in the middle of the woods like this. It all gives off the vibe of some guy in his basement making up stories on an unlicensed and illegal radio broadcast in order to encourage people to do awful things. So anyways, why does this strange Swedish voice tell us about the War of the Worlds broadcast, and why does he say it was real? Well, listen to the next bit of dialogue from him.
Övervakar och ser allt. Lita ej på mig. Lita ej på polisen. De är redan kontrollerade av dem.
Don't trust the news, don't trust the police, they're already controlled by them, as they have been for 75 years. Well, the news would of course be the radio host, reading off stories about all of these murders. See, he's trying to control us. Like I said before, by telling all of these stories, he's brainwashing these men into killing their wives, and he's making the War of the Worlds broadcast a reality, so to speak. I think it's safe to say that 204863 is a sort of activation phrase that makes these brainwashed men start the killing, like a sleeper agent. Don't trust the police also makes sense, as these stories that the radio host is broadcasting seem to be citing police reports. I think that the most reasonable connection here is that the quote-unquote aliens that are hinted at in the Swedish man's dialogue are, in fact, the Order, or as I'll call them for simplicity's sake, the Cult of Silent Hill. You know, the guys who worship the town and kidnapped Harry Mason's daughter to be a midwife for their god in the first Silent Hill game. So, in my mind, the Cult of Silent Hill are the ones who are essentially egging on all of these murderers. The radio host is one of them. Hold on to that. It'll be important in a moment. Well, next up, we need to see some raw evidence of this brainwashing taking place. So, right after the Swedish voice comes in on the radio to warn us, is when we hear that murder audio through the people, and we can literally hear the same radio voice egging on the murderer. So, all that's left to do now is see which kind of man is most susceptible to this brainwashing, what kind of man this cult is targeting. Right after the peephole scene, the baby in the sink talked about how you were fired from your job and started to drown your sorrows in booze. Your wife had to get a job where she was ogled at by her boss, and one day you snapped and killed the whole family. That's essentially our player character's backstory, but as I'll get into in a moment, it also lines up surprisingly well with something that happened to Kojima himself. Anyways, at this point we know too much. We know not to trust the radio, we know why we killed our wife, and we know that some group, the Cult of Silent Hill, has been brainwashing guys like us to do the same, and we can even infer that 204863 is the activation phrase. Knowing that activation phrase means that it won't work on us anymore. What happens next is that the game starts glitching out. Then a voice, which isn't coming from the environment, but from the game itself, says,
204863. 204863. 204863.
and then the game crashes. Basically, I think that PT was, in terms of its own lore, a game that was created by the Cult of Silent Hill to brainwash us players into killing our loved ones, just as the player character did. But because this strange Swedish voice was able to inject itself into the game, PT's brainwashing didn't work on us. We're no longer sticking to the script, and so the game crashes. That sounds like a pretty insane, off-the-cuff theory, I know, but what has me really convinced that this is what Kojima Productions was going for is simple. The loading icon. These 3 circles. Here's a symbol from Silent Hill lore called the Halo of the Sun. Basically, it's the symbol of the Order, the Cult of Silent Hill. These 3 circles. While of course this isn't literally the case, in the fiction of this game, we as players are engaging with software that was designed to make us kill our families. So now we can get into the autobiographical side of this game, the metaphor that drives all of these events that are described to us over the radio and through the visions and the words of the fetus in the sink. I'm going to start with the most concrete connections, so that I can convince you that there is some merit to what I'm saying here. When the fetus is telling us the story of Jack losing his job, he says,
"You remember, right? Exactly 10 months back.
Well, 10 months before PT was published is exactly when Hideo Kojima was kicked off of the board of directors at Konami. It's when he essentially found out that Metal Gear Solid V would be his last game with the company. Yes, he was still the lead of Kojima Productions, but he lost his job 10 months back from this game's release date, just like the baby says. And this trend of guys losing their jobs, the one that the radio host says is sparking all of this violence, well, Hideo Kojima lost his job because some crappy mobile game that nobody remembers made more money than his art could. And that is most definitely a trend that's taking place not just in the gaming industry, but all over the world. Film, social media apps, fast food, deliveries, you name it. In the world of business, heart and soul is being shifted out in exchange for quick and dirty cash. I don't mean to sound too preachy, but look at companies like EA and Ubisoft, McDonald's, Blizzard, Google, or Facebook, and look at how far they've all strayed from the original, more noble intentions that they had when they were founded. Look at how many governments have been bought by lobbyists. It's a trend, and it's one that, if continued perpetually, can only end in the death of human nature, and it's a trend that Konami is embodying just as well as any of those others. Throughout his whole career, Kojima was seemingly told, do what you want with Metal Gear because we love you and it generates a nice profit. Now, suddenly, the message he was getting from Konami was simply, we hate you because we found a way to generate even more profit. I mean, you can look up the development hell that Metal Gear Solid V went through while PT was being quietly developed in the background. It's an ugly, ugly story of a company trying their damnedest to make a man hate his job, going to lengths against Kojima that I haven't heard of from even the most outwardly evil game publishers in the world. Point is, Jack is Hideo Kojima. And in my mind, that whole thing about, are you sure the only you is you, is about Kojima facing that crushing blow to morale that was losing his job to a crappy game with no passion or soul behind it. My personal interpretation of this game's events is that we're playing as this version of Jack that killed his wife, and the version of Kojima that gave up on game development and abandoned his career after he was shunned from Konami. And rather than summoning Jack through our chanting like a lot of people think, I think that we're contacting the other version of Jack, who took his lumps and kept on trucking. I don't like to say things like, this must be how Kojima felt, because this is how I interpret his game, but it seems to me that PT is the story of Hideo Kojima feeling like everything is hopeless and his career is over. But at this moment, when we chant Jack into the face of our dead wife, we're connecting with the version of Kojima and of Jack that didn't give up because of this major setback. PT, as depressing and dark as it is, feels like a story about never giving up, even when all feels so hopeless and pointless. Such an optimistic message arising from such a dark story is really on brand for Kojima. More on that in the outro. I don't think that Kojima wanted to make Konami look bad by hyping up the fanbase for a new Silent Hill game, knowing full well that it would be cancelled. That would be petty and frankly mean to the fans. I do think that this was an honest-to-God pitch to Konami, saying, hey, look how many people are going to buy the shit out of this game if you let me make it. But within that pitch was the cynical and half-correct assumption that it wouldn't matter to them, and that Kojima Productions' time at Konami was going to die at this moment. And yet, beneath all of that cynicism is still the determination, that message, I'll be back and I'm bringing my new toys with me. Kojima wasn't giving up on game development. Then you've got that big can of worms I warned about earlier. As I said earlier, just before you enter the final puzzle in PT, the game crashes, with one of 6 error messages popping up. Like I said, in my mind, this means that the Swedish voice essentially hacked himself into the game and messed up the brainwashing procedure, and so the game crashed. Well, that's what I think the literal meaning behind these crashes is, but there's a lot more to dissect here. So, out of these 6 error messages, the most telling is simply development halted due to inexplicable bug. As far as I'm concerned, this one outright confirms that Kojima doubted that Silent Hills would ever see the light of day. I mean, development halted? That's not an error message, that's a game being cancelled. But there's another message that I'm super fixated on. Knowing you, I was sure that you would notice this game and play it. I will never, can never forget that day 20 years ago. I have something to tell you. Contact me. Jay. So, Jay must be Jack, and Jack is a stand-in for Hideo Kojima himself, so the only question that remains is who this message was meant for. Who did Kojima know would play this game, and who shared that unforgettable moment with him 20 years ago? Well, it seems to me that this message was meant for one specific person. After spending a disgusting amount of time researching Hideo Kojima's early career and even trying to figure out who this Jay might be if it isn't Jack, I came to the conclusion that few people other than Kojima and the person that this message was meant for would know what this was about. It's not satisfying, but it's understandable. However, as I was driving home from the park where I was doing my research, I decided to watch the, at the time, latest episode of Hideo Kojima's podcast, Brain Structure, which featured a long-standing friend of his, director of the Ghost in the Shell film adaptation, Mamoru Oshii. Frankly, I don't give this theory a lot of credence, and I don't think that it's important to anyone but Kojima and this mysterious friend of his, but the timeline does line up. Everything from their first introductions to Oshii and Kojima connecting again 2 years after this game came out and that message was left to be found. Oshii seems to be a man with great respect for the medium of video games and Kojima's work. He even made an adventure game of his own around the time that Kojima was developing Policenauts. So again, don't take that as an answer. Mamoru Oshii is just the best candidate that I can find to tie off this frankly tangential loose end. So now it's time to talk about that ending. Not the big reveal at the end, but the radio voice coming back one last time.
Dad was such a drag. Every day he'd eat the same kind of food, dress the same, sit in front of the same kind of games. Yeah, he was just that kind of guy. But then one day he goes and kills us all. He couldn't even be original about the way he did it. I'm not complaining. I was dying of boredom anyway. But guess what? I will be coming back, and I'm bringing my new toys with me.
I was really tempted to say that this was referring to Hideo Kojima feeling like he had killed his family, Kojima Productions. That line about sitting in front of the same kinds of games, it really sounds like he was talking about Metal Gear and how bored he was with the series, which is a well-documented fact. It also lines up with my idea that Jack is a stand-in for Kojima, and that Jack literally did kill his family. That was one of those takes that nobody else had apparently put forward yet, that my boyfriend was super impressed by. But I think I have to concede on this one. I think it's most definitely about Konami. Konami were the ones that were making Kojima work on Metal Gear for so long, when clearly he had other ideas brewing. I guarantee that PT wasn't the first time he tried to pitch a Silent Hill game to them. The dad in the story just plain has to be Konami. It's the only explanation that makes sense. Konami is the one that killed Kojima Productions, not Hideo Kojima, and Kojima's the one that's speaking here. Even viewing Kojima as a stand-in for our wife killer, Jack, it makes sense given how much emphasis the game puts on the fact that this wife-murdering thing is a trend, a cycle. Konami killed Kojima's family, Kojima Productions, and that made Kojima want to, quote-unquote, kill his family by giving up on game development. But as the radio host says at the end of the game, he will be coming back. So now we get to the big question that I've seen a lot of people asking before immediately getting shut down. Is Death Stranding Silent Hills? Well, I don't think so, but there's a lot more to it than a simple no. This is where we get into one of the major motifs of the Silent Hill series, two parallel realities. As you can see here in Silent Hill 3, this normal pedestrian mall suddenly turns into a nightmare version of the same environment. They both exist at the same time and place, but they're parallel to each other, much like the beach in the normal world in the lore of Death Stranding. Well, that's happening in PT also. There's a whole lot of talk in this game about two separate realities. In my mind, the metaphor, these two realities, are the two different futures for Kojima Productions. There's one where this ridiculous plan to keep his studio in the AAA space actually works, and he gets to make the Silent Hill game of his dreams. And there's another where Kojima Productions goes indie and produces Death Stranding with the help of Sony, who had already proven their willingness to help him achieve his goals in the simple fact that they published this game without Konami's knowledge or consent. The title, Silent Hills, plural, of course refers to the multiverse-adjacent idea that everyone sees Silent Hill in their own way.
Monsters? They look like monsters to you?
But it also hints at the fact that Kojima was, in a way, teasing two separate games, two separate realities with this reveal trailer. At the end of this game, there's the reveal of Silent Hill, and then there's the reveal for the other Silent Hill, Death Stranding. Death Stranding, of course, heavily leans into these themes of two separate realities existing at the same time. The multiverse is a confirmed thing in that lore. And of course, you've got the beach on top of that. The beach being parallel but opposite to the normal world is exactly like the nightmare version of Silent Hill running parallel to the mundane version. But I think it goes a bit further still. I mean, hell, in PT, you've got a fetus that was robbed of its life by an abusive father whose drive was destroyed by an evil company. And in Death Stranding, you have a happy, well-nurtured fetus that becomes the player character's best friend. I don't think Kojima had all of these fine details worked out 6 or 7 years before Death Stranding came out. He's not a superhuman. But the connections are there, and to write off those connections as simply Kojima thinks fetuses are freaky in a good way is super reductive, and above all else, boring as hell. My favorite connection of all, though, after the game that predicted the end of Kojima's time as a AAA game developer, a voice said, "I will be coming back." And 3 years later, when Death Stranding was revealed, Kojima walked into the stage and simply said,
"Hello everyone, I'm back."
It's time for me to return this PS4 and this copy of PT to its rightful owner. Over my time with it, I learned a lot of things. Some of them are even brand new discoveries as far as I can tell. I may not have been able to solve every last mystery about PT. I haven't figured out why the ending sequence sometimes solved itself without me doing anything special. I haven't figured out why chanting Lisa works, but other names don't when the clues specifically say I whispered his name. I haven't figured out who Norman Reedus' character is, given that he looks nothing like Jack. I haven't figured out the significance of the blue, yellow, green, and red tinted flashlights you get occasionally, or what that zipper sound is when Lisa kills you, or what exactly Kojima's new toys were that he mentioned in the final cutscene, or why these handprints are in the basement stairwell, or why Kojima's birthday randomly had an O inserted between the 2 and the 4. But I've got faith that once a more detailed-oriented person than myself finally solves this game's last mystery, all that we've learned will slot perfectly into the following summary. PT is a game in which we walk through the guilt of a family murderer who was fired from his job and encouraged towards violence by a man who sees murdering as an almost religious ceremony. We complete a ritual, connecting ourselves with the alternate version of ourselves that didn't lose hope when he was fired and didn't kill his wife, and finally the radio operator who tormented us for so long lets us out of the house. And PT is also a metaphor for the never-ending and ever-worsening battle of passion, creativity, heart, and soul versus cold, hard, soulless cash, and how the only acceptable option in that battle is to never give up on your passions. It's a game that tried so hard to save itself from death while knowing full well that it was an impossible task. It's a game that was designed to set up the story of Death Stranding by showcasing the dire circumstances that Kojima Productions was struggling to stay determined throughout, and that connections and honest-to-God friendship would eventually help them out of. Thematically, it's a bridge between the messy, angsty, and self-destructive ending to the Metal Gear series and the blossoming of new life that was Death Stranding. And it's the most interesting game of all time. Before I close out today's video and get to work on another more real-life oriented topic, I'd just like to thank all of the patrons who are supporting this channel. Right now I have a goal set that if I can get to $3,000 a month on Patreon, I will stop running ads on all future uploads. And the patrons who are helping most with that are these $10 plus patrons. And those patrons are Ada Avery, Almost Dead Again, Amy Marshall, Anatoly Volnov, Askel, Atheist, Bendeline, Big Time Jim, Bobby Blitz, Broiled Lemming, Bjorb, Calliope Ronis, Cass, Charlotte, Chun Gina, Colin Gajic, Darius Fazier, David Perkins, Deadly Marcelin, Demise, Dennis Voshakamer, Dominic Johan, Eduardo Roca, Emma Plays Go, Erica, Eva Knight, Fluffy Puppy Casey, Franz Johannes Fulner, George Rosenbaum, Haunted Mystic, Holly Schmidt, I Cashern, IJK, Joannis, Jake Everdeen, Gerard Drake, Joit, Jonas Shee, Jonas, JP, Julian My Julian, Kay, Caleb, Kenneth Enfinger, Knife, Laffy, Legally Graphic, Lil Bunda, Lilith Van Boss Hibiscus, Lily Leons, Liv, Luz M, Madison Crater, Michaela, Megan Walker, Mia Mako, Monkey Monks Monkey Monastery, Mr. Kokoko, Mramra 1999, Neris, Neurofilter, Nicole, Nomad, Of Lucian, Okid, Panda, Penelope CN, Poof Donut, Praxabettle, Raxvan, Robert Botang, Rune Fox, CeeLo, Sean Hamilton, Shay No, Shay Theus, Stelly, Swatchbox, Vega Nelson, Verdus de Protogen, Yas the Boss, Zoe, and Zyrobly. Sorry that I have to do so many jump cuts every time I read the patron names lately. There's a lot of names here, 83 this week to be exact, and I am actually very bad at reading scripts and not messing up. But anyways, thanks to all of those people for just working towards an ad-free Leadhead, because I think that'll just be great for everybody. But anyways, I'll see you in the next video.